in Arlington. This is a hybrid public meeting which enables remote electronic participation as legally authorized by the Code of Virginia per the Planning Commission's electronic meeting policy adopted July 7, 2022. I think we have all our LRPC members participating in person, but we'll go around in a little bit after I go through these announcements and see who is actually participating online. I'd like to orient everyone to our hybrid environment and cover a few specifics about how tonight's meeting is going to be run. Members of the public may attend this meeting here in person or electronically by using the Microsoft Teams link provided on the LRPC web pages, the county's events calendar, and on the email notification sent to the LRPC and JoCo email subscribers. Additionally, there is a dial-in phone option for those wishing to use it. For any planning commissioners who are joining virtually, if you lose internet connectivity, please reconnect to us by phone. Also, please keep your phones and devices muted until you're called upon. Turn off sound to any other devices around you to minimize interference. For our virtual attendees using Microsoft Teams, please turn off your video feed, and I'll address when it's appropriate to turn it on in a little bit. The Microsoft Teams meeting chat is active, but only to serve two purposes. One is to assist participants who need technical support, and second, for participants to pose brief, clarifying questions to the larger audience. While the clarifying questions will be monitored, they will not be formally acknowledged, and staff may address these comments as appropriate. The Teams chat should not be used for discussion or inappropriate statements. Those who are planning to provide public comment may only do so at the end of this meeting, as the chat may not be used for that purpose. All public comments must be shared verbally for the record during the assigned public testimony periods. I'd also like to note for everybody here in the room, please speak up slowly and clearly because the microphones are above us on the ceiling in order to enable the virtual participants to hear everything we say. For LRPC members, if the commissioners participating virtually wish to be recognized to speak on an item during the course of the meeting, please turn on your video feed and raise your virtual hand in Teams. I, as well as staff, Natasha here, will monitor the video feeds. Now, do we have any commission members who joined us by telephone today without a video option? Not hearing anybody, so I'll take that as a no unless we were on mute. Additional notes for our members of the public who'd like to provide feedback and comment. Unlike the Planning Commission's regular meetings, the LRPC agenda item is not a public hearing. Therefore, public comment is at the LRPC chair at my discretion. I will be calling on speakers at the end of the meeting after the committee discussion is concluded, because I will be allowing public comment. Members of the public attending virtually will speak first, followed by anybody who here is in person. Speaking time will depend on the number of speakers. Assume 2 minutes. And add your name to the speakers list here. If anybody's here, nobody's here. Virtual attendees indicate in the chat if you'd like to comment, and your name will be added to the list of speakers. Ms. Alfonso Ahmed will also acknowledge your request in the Teams chat. When virtual attendees are called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that's located in your meeting command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. Only you can do that. However, you will be muted when your time has concluded. As an alternative, public comment may be provided on the public comment form posted on the LRPC webpage. Finally, this is a public forum. Tonight's meeting is being recorded and is being posted to the county website. All the information associated with tonight's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Freedom of Information Act requirements. Okay, why don't we now go around the room? First off, why don't we see who's here virtually before we do any introductions at the table? So, do we have anybody who's virtually?
There are no commissioners so far signed on.
Okay,
virtually.
So neither for the Planning Commission or any other commissions?
No.
Okay, great. We do have a quorum, by the way, so why don't we go around and introduce around the room and start with the moderator.
Sure, thank you, Jim. Natasha Alfonso Ahmed. I'm with the Planning Department, with the Planning Division in the Comprehensive Planning and Housing Development Department.
I did mention, I am Jim Rantelmi. I am the temporary chair for this LRPC. Commissioner Patel was not able to be here tonight, otherwise she would have chaired it.
Kelly Peterson, Vice Chair of Planning.
Tony Striner, I'm also with the Planning Commission.
Jill Hungar, I'm with CPHD.
And Mark McCauley with AED. Jill and I are co-chairs of the Commercial Market Resilience Initiative in general and this initiative about transforming Arlington's office buildings.
Okay, very good. I guess we're now ready for a discussion. We've gone around the table, we've introduced ourselves, we got all the admin stuff out of the way. So, staff, it's yours, time for your presentation.
Great. Thank you for the time this evening. Hope everyone can hear me online. I'll be going through a pretty substantive presentation. We'll try to go through as quickly, but want to leave time for discussion, but also leave it up to the chair. There are natural breaks in the presentation. If there are questions, happy to do it however you want to handle it. Certainly, I want to make this more conversational, particularly at this stage in the engagement process. So just to sort of set everyone's bearings, we did have an RTA that went to the board in September, which passed on the consent agenda, which advertised two separate items, both related to this concept of transforming Arlington's office buildings. One is the policy, which we'll be spending a lot of time talking about today, which is still in concept, although we will be releasing a public first draft on Tuesday, a week from today. And that will look at justification and impact for why this policy should exist, why we're looking at adaptive reuse, and I'll define that in a moment as a first step, and then other policy initiatives looking at other tools to reuse office space, particularly obsolete office space in the county. The second part of the RTA was looking at potential zoning code amendments, zoning ordinance amendments that would allow for a more streamlined process and a new streamlined process. And then as it relates to that, while the board doesn't pass admin regulation changes, the Arlington County zoning code changes and administrative go hand in hand. So we typically will also discuss those. And I lost sorry about that. And the admin regs will look at a number of things like further process elements that we'll be discussing today, timing of process and the role of the community in the community review process, including standing commissions such as the Planning Commission and committees like SPRC. And then it's things that I think are part of the back of house operation, but very critical is things like what is the checklist for submittal of applications? What do you have to supply to the county and for review? And what are the standard conditions through which we would be applying? So this is all RTA'd in September for November action. There has been a number of pieces of engagement on this already. The most notable being a July 31st lunch and learn, where we talked in very broad concepts. This is our first meeting in front of any of the commissions or committees. We intend, as we get into October, to have another. So this is really meant to be introductory information item. As we get closer to the board action, we'll probably having another either separate meetings or a joint meeting with LRPC and ZOCO to discuss some of the finer details that were released, as it said, in the next week. So we'll start with the part of the justification for why we're here. What does the office market look like in Arlington, and why should we, as Arlingtonians and staff, care about what is typically seen as a very cyclical process and sort of how markets react? So when we look at structural shifts, and you'll hear the term structural a lot tonight, and what we're really saying is there are markets often work in cycles. There'll be economic downturns and upturns, and markets will react to that with supply and demand. And there's usually corrections which put the market back into stability, and then it all starts over again, right? Many of the shifts we're seeing that we will argue are more structural in nature. They are longer term. They are inherent to structural shifts in the economy, or how, in this case, how people use office space or will be using office space. And this is just a reminder of, we've seen a number of these elements of structural changes over time, from persistent headwinds like stagnating regional demand, continued downward pressure on utilization rates, and federal footprint decision compression that are, and particularly the federal footprint, which has been very structural. It hasn't changed. Administrations have had different perspectives on it, but it hasn't really changed the view of less federal space, cheaper cost alternatives. That is this obviously, rate of that not listed here is the BRAC, which happened in the 2000s, but really felt its impact in the 2010s. Then we had obviously a structural positive shift, which was the Amazon HQ2 and a lot of momentum around that, where we saw some leasing activity pick up, not just Amazon, but related to Amazon. We saw some downward pressure on vacancy rates as Amazon established themselves as a core part of our economic picture here. And we looked at strengthened investment market for older and office buildings. So people were interested in buying office buildings, repositioning office buildings with this idea that the demand for office was going to increase in Arlington. And we have seen a lot of that, although, again, no one saw the pandemic coming. And I won't go into too much detail because we've all lived through it and all understand the basic characteristics, but it really shook up how office buildings are viewed by tenants, how much they're used, when they're used, how they're used, and particularly as the return to office, our RTO as an acronym, is still really being figured out. It's created a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace, both from a leasing perspective, but also from an investment perspective. If you're buying an office building, you're still concerned about where's the next wave of demand going to come from, or am I going to be left holding a building in a new world where office occupancy isn't nearly as high. And one of the themes that we'll talk about a lot tonight, both in the presentation and in discussion, is what has really happened is that the older, less competitive buildings are the really ones being left behind. Newer value buildings, higher value buildings will get the flight to quality tenant demand, but we'll see this real drop in interest at any rate in these older, less functional buildings. Post-pandemic, we once again see the uncertainty. We're now seeing lease expirations. So a lot of what happened during the pandemic, we were predicting, but we're now seeing what happens when people their leases actually expire and the decisions they're making. And it's been a mixed bag. Some people have taken the same amount of space. Some companies taking the same amount of space. Some have gotten out of the office space business altogether. So it's ranged but they're all using the space differently if they take it. And then we've seen significant capital market disruption, which is partly cyclical, but partly structural related to the office investor profile. For interest rates are a cyclical factor, but investor confidence in the office sector, we think, is going to be a long-term structural challenge. So what happens when we see these sort of massive distress or disruptions? We have a race to the bottom where a lot of buildings are constantly trying to outbid each other for that valuable tenant out there that's looking for space. A lot of tenant leverage, so they're asking for the best terms, the best rates, the best fit outs, those sort of things. It's driving down building income, which drives down values. At the same time, we're seeing a flight to quality. So those tenants are going after the best buildings and using their leverage. They're not interested in a low-cost alternative in a bad building. They're looking for a low-cost alternative in a Class A trophy building. And so those buildings have continued to seek leasing volume, albeit at rates and terms that probably nearly aren't as attractive as they thought they would be. And then what happens? So what happens to these less competitive and or obsolete assets? Some decide to try to survive and then end up in default because ultimately you can't race yourself to the bottom out of this. You continue to have worse and worse leases, and eventually the banks will say these leases are not worth signing anymore. And often the owner says this building isn't worth owning anymore. On a positive, what we've seen is buildings that are close to trophy in Class A repositioning and putting investments in a building to reach that sort of quality level to get part of that flight to quality market. We've also seen, as always, a lot of redevelopment. And I think redevelopment has changed course in Arlington. As many of you know from me sitting on the commission, we're seeing a lot more redevelopment where it's partial redevelopment, where people are keeping garages and podiums, those sort of things, but really is a reaction to obsolete office buildings, what to do with them, and obviously redevelopment. If the floor plates don't match the ability to reuse them, to tear them down or start new, but to keep elements of the site that still have value, like parking mostly. And what we'll talk a lot about today is the first step of our policy regulation is adaptive reuse. And so this is often called conversions in other places. For some reason, I decided to call something different just to maybe be difficult, but also because I think there's a lot of people use conversions in a lot of different ways. And we really wanted to make sure we were being clear about what redevelopment was versus adaptive reuse. And this is where the building is essentially staying the same, maybe some changes to facades or ground floor, but you're really just converting the use inside the building. Just to put in another finer point on sort of how this market is operating, when we look at occupied trophy buildings, we were seeing values at $500, $550, even $600 a square foot as a assessed value. Now these, given macro trends, even these buildings are having a hard time holding their value because overall downward pressure on values. With rising cap rates, we're seeing a significant number of Board of Equalization appeals, which obviously roll like dominoes. Once a couple win, more and more folks are going into that process to get there. So we're sitting just bringing this in an assessment roles. Folks that are involved in that process know that our assessments usually lag at least a year, sometimes 2 years, because the data is sort of always a year looking back. And so sometimes we see the problem before we feel it in the assessments, and that's certainly what we're seeing now. We see vacancy and looking for the needs to upgrade to remain competitive. So we see, buildings that are holding on maybe lost 20 to 30% of their value due to these macro and micro level conditions, but are approaching market risk. And then down at the bottom, we're seeing this fully vacant distress and then distressed sales. And distressed sales is where the owner has given it back to the bank. If you're familiar with this, how this market works, every major market crash, banks become pretty smart about owning real estate. It takes about 10 years. The minute the market recovers, they forget all that, they fire all those people, and then they go back to not knowing how to own buildings. And this is not a criticism of our folks in the banking industry, but because they don't know how to own buildings. A building owned by a bank is usually poorly managed, isn't aggressively looking for leases, is really not looking to increase value, is looking to get out at cents on a dollar and recoup some of its original investment, and usually trying to get the debt off the books and have the equity take the biggest hit. So we're seeing sales now of distressed assets that once maybe 5 years ago were $300, $400, $500 a square foot at $50 a square foot. And you can imagine from a tax base, which we'll get into, how significantly altering that is.
We're seeing that in Arlington right
Yes.
now?
Yes. So a number of the recent sales have been in the 50s. We've seen a lot of transactions where even of occupied office space within a span of years, really proven, 2018, 2019 vintage owners that bought in 2018 that sold just recently for 40, 50, 60% of the value that they bought it for. And that's not even the distressed, fully vacant buildings or soon to be vacant buildings that are just selling. And we've seen a number of those come through the site that are coming through the site plan process. So what is the new reality? Well, again, structural changes. So one of the biggest points we want to make is we wouldn't be rewriting a policy if in 2 years the market would correct itself and we'd be back to normal, right? We really know that we're going to have of our roughly 42 million square feet of leased office space in Arlington, that we have a significant part of that is older, obsolete buildings that need to be repurposed. And the private market is going to do that, but regulations need to really leverage or support that private market solution, often which will be to reuse that site or building for something other than office. And we really don't see our way, demand side solving out of this. We don't see a massive jump in demand side that is going to fill this space, particularly since they're obsolete buildings. So it's really that, I mentioned revenue impacts that lag behind current realities. And when we've talked about policy and we've talked with the board about this through various points of the CMRI and talked to groups like this, or committees like this and the general public, the first action is stabilization. Everyone wants a quick silver bullet, but really what we need to do is stop the bleeding. We need to start thinking about how to take obsolete office buildings that are placing a downward pressure on the overall market off the market and sort of stabilize the market, and then work from that up to rebuilding a stronger office market that may be smaller in square footage, but is much healthier. And as an example, I'll give you, we are seeing now for the first time in a long time, a number of site plans that are building new office. And everyone's saying, well, that's crazy. Why would someone build new office? And the answer is, those are exactly the buildings that can attract the right tenants. New trophy buildings with the right green building, all the right bells and whistles. We just need to replace all the older ones that could never attract that type of tenant. So that's kind of the general, and the policy that you'll read will spend obviously a fair amount of time sort of setting the stage for that. That really doesn't mean anything if we didn't then translate it into what the fiscal impact is in the county, right? Because we're not doing this to bail out an industry. We're not, that's not our business as local government. We're looking at stabilizing our fiscal health and the commercial sector having a big part of that. So when you look at the impact of commercial sector decline, this chart shows the assessed values in both dollars and percent of total assessed values in the county for a commercial office. And you'll see from 2014, it was roughly just under 22%. 2024, it's around 14% and declining. You can obviously see the significant drop that it's had in the amount of dollars as it has not kept up. And when we talk about the 50-50 balance in Arlington, we're now at 45-55 commercial to residential. But as you know from commission members, that almost all of that 45 has been buoyed by a strong apartment sector, which counts as commercial. And office has really continued to decline. So it has a significant sort of impact on, and I have, the amount of dollars, and if we had just kept the values the same in office, we would have gained about $60 million of revenues over the past 10 years. If we had seen a little bit of growth, it's now in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a school, it's all the services we need. So what is the justification and opportunity for intervention? Well, we wanted to start with a policy approach. So for those of you familiar, as many of you are, and particularly Leo having to write those horribly long CMRI use change table with every zoning district in the book, resolutions. We've usually taken with CMRI sort of an RTA, get to an action, come to you with the commission, come to the board and get approval. And the overall policy framework for lack of a term supporting that was a very public acknowledgement by the board of support for it, but it was never written down anywhere. It wasn't a policy. As we said, okay, if we're going to do something that's much more significant, which is really changing the nature of how we look at amending site plans for office space, for office buildings, we probably need to have alongside of it a very thorough policy to sort of justify it and to lay out what the board is actually guiding staff to do to come back with further actions and further amendments to our regulations and our other policies. So it provides that background, it provides justification for urgency of action. You'll hear a lot me talk about over the next month, and Jill as well, and certainly to the board, of why urgency is important and why this is really something that we should all, we don't like to use the word crisis a lot because crisis tends to imply sort of a helplessness, but it certainly is a challenge that needs urgency. And again, the policy allows for specific guidance that everyone knows what we're getting into when we come back in 3 months, 6 months with another action that changes the zoning ordinance, that it's baked into something. And obviously the LRPC obviously knows the relationship of our policies relative to actions and how important that relationship is. So what did the overarching policy goes? A bold and robust public intervention into the commercial market, specifically efforts to streamline processes and allow for market-driven recovery strategies. So what this means away from a word salad is that middle part, which is a streamlined process. So right now, if you want to do an adaptive reuse in Arlington, it's not prohibited, you can do it. But in our zoning code, the change in the primary use of more than, help me out here, Jill, 5%? 5%, so 5% of the gross square footage of primary use triggers a major site plan amendment. And the major site plan amendment has a very specific purpose in Arlington that looks at very, very significant new developments and major amendments that are changing the very nature of the building. And that probably doesn't align with these types of projects, as well as it creates a level of time and uncertainty for investors that are looking to really jump on these opportunities, but don't want to invest years of their capital or try to wait to see what comes out the other end. So we want to reduce the less competitive function obsolete by support, that will support the fiscal health. Again, we could go into a lot of detail about the market dynamics here, but for every building that is empty and desperate, it affects every other building that is healthy and trying to lease. We've seen that example where lease rates are held hostage in the county for years by 1 or 2 major properties that are trying to win deals. And transition to alternative uses. And a lot of people talk about resi. Resi is definitely one that's commonly. We're seeing a lot of hospitality, however, interest. So, and that's good for us as well because we need more hotel rooms. And then maybe some innovative uses. But I think the one takeaway from tonight, one of the big takeaways, and one of the big takeaways we'll try to layer into as much as possible is we are trying to establish the adaptive reuse as a public priority. And what that means is not just wordsmithing. It's the language in our ordinance that establishes the types of things that the board can use to modify things like density and height. So it's typically affordable housing, green building, transportation, open space. I think I probably missed some, but it's in state code. It comes to us, and we put it into our ordinance. And while some may, and this will be open for discussion, people say, well, do you really need to do that? When we looked at how we changed the zoning code and so on, so well, how do you give density that it doesn't cost so much that it kills the project? Well, the only way you do that is the board is very clear that the project itself is a public priority. In this case, and that means you have to very much put guardrails around what the project is, right? It's an office building, it's adaptive reuse, it's not any project in Arlington. But that's an important takeaway that will be discussed, obviously, right up until we go to the board in November. I mentioned focused policy response. So the policy is going to focus on adaptive reuse, which is the change in the principal use, with minimal changes to building form. We'll talk about in minimal and nominal, and we use those terms, but we fear not, we are going to address and define those, because what's minimal to one person may not be minimal to another person. But really think about mainly the concept of adaptive reuse is keeping the building the same. Certainly with height and sort of building form, mostly the same. Repositioning, which as I mentioned is investment in existing office buildings, again, typically keeping the form the same, but providing better amenities in the building. And then redevelopment is a spectrum, as I said, and we'll talk about that in the policy document, but it's everything from, we've seen one in the past 15 years, which is 20th, where someone did a old BRAC building, gutted it, Vornado did it, and they added 6 stories. So that's 2020th, which is a luxury apartment building. That's what we call sort of a adaptive reuse plus. It was adaptive reuse, but they added stories. We have seen what we call sort of the partial redevelopment, where people are looking at sites and sort of saying, what can I maintain? As I mentioned, like parking, our podiums, our retail podiums, and then obviously full-scale redevelopment is what we more typically see, which is a sort of, often sector plan driven sort of full redevelopment of a site. Why we focus first on adaptive reuse? Well, the policy intends to provide that specific near-term guidance. And one of the reasons why we chose adaptive reuse, and we'll talk about some of the benefits in a second, is just that it is a good test case for how we can think differently about our processes, while continuing to have conversations about when building form does change, when height does change, what is the appropriate level of review. So trying to sort of create a control, for lack of a better term, where we're looking at change in primary use, primary interior fit out conversion. The buzzword in the industry now for conversions is it's now hammer ready instead of shovel ready. The idea that you're using mostly tools to do fit outs with anything doesn't mean it's not significant fit out, but it's still mostly interior. If you walk by the building, other than maybe some scaffolding, you wouldn't notice that a lot is happening to the building. Common area upgrades is important, particularly change of use. And we've seen a lot of examples across the region and nation where some pretty interesting products have come out of adaptive reuse. We will talk about exceptions to change in building form and perhaps increases in density, like ground floor repositioning, rooftops, going from mechanical to maybe some occupiable space where appropriate, terraces and mezzanines, facade refresh, landscaping refresh, outdoor amenities, and 2 things that aren't listed here, but we'll talk about, and certainly not listed because of lack of importance. There's also a lot of this stuff where when you crack open the site plan, you may find out you excluded, say, an elevator bank from GFA. Well, a residential building may not meet as many elevator banks as an office building, and developers will get creative about recapturing that space for other uses that may require GFA. Well, I mean, that's the math of the density, but you don't know that from the outside. That's inside the building. Same thing with mezzanines. You may create a mezzanine level, but it's still not changing the structure. And then one interesting discussion, which will be encapsulated in the policy, and we'll see how far we get, because this is a bigger discussion perhaps, but we're going to test with adaptive reuse, is when you don't need as much parking, what do you do with all that parking? And how do you translate it into other uses like storage or underground commerce or amenity space? that still need GFA, whereas underground parking today for most site plans does not count as GFA. So what is the value proposition? Well, I won't read this, and this obviously you have access to this deck, and I'm happy to go back to this if people are interested. But all this streamlined approach, I can really boil up into it's returning an asset to fiscal health much quicker than any other process we have, other than strict market response to sort of filling a building. That and building repositioning, but certainly in terms of changing use, this is a typical adaptive reuse project, maybe 12, 16, 18, maybe 24 months from when they have the permits and when they can do construction, versus we know new construction takes 3, 4, 5 years often, depending on the complexity. So what happens is that adaptive reuse can very quickly adapt to a market and capture that market. New construction is always at the whims of a good idea 5 years ago may be a bad idea when you enter the ground. You have to adapt, but you can't change the building, right? And the second is that it does then take with that $50 a square foot asset and then returns it to, say, a residential or hospitality use that again is back at $300, $400, $500 a square foot of value. And now you are not only turning it around, but you're recovering a significant amount of that tax revenue. The other point here is that as we think about, I know there'll be a lot of discussion probably tonight and many other commissions and committees in the general public about the housing market. We found that these generally slip in very well just under new construction. So they're kind of like a brand new sort of second generation housing stock, because while folks have gotten very smart about how to do the adaptive reuse, they still are a little bit, they're not as efficient as new buildings. And so you have some weird spaces and things like that. So you tend up getting some really unique units and really different price points that you often see, and very, very efficient. And for those of you that know that, and Leo and architecture, I mean, the way that we design residential now is like every square inch is efficient, right? You're not leaving anything to chance. If it costs to build it, it's got to be the revenue. We see some interesting projects where people can make stuff work. Amenity spaces may be different. So there may be different value propositions, not just associated with rent, but it won't be quote unquote affordable housing, but it would just be a different price point under new production of Class A market rate. And one of the things we'll talk about, and I don't want to bury this because there's some slides that talk about it, but I want to make sure it continues to get played, particularly among this committee, is there are some trade-offs, right? Things like sector plans, which call for have different visions about use or about changing of buildings or moving of buildings. Redevelopment as a fundamental element of change in a neighborhood may be delayed, or in our case, we don't know if things are delayed because it maybe was never going to happen in the first place, but it still is something that we all have to have sort of discussions about when we look at sector plans or other policies. So there will be trade-offs. Another one we'll talk a lot about is other policies like affordable housing, like green building. Some conversions may not be the best opportunities to do pure affordable housing, given some of the financial. We may see significant upgrades in green building, but it may not be the places to provide the best, the most sort of cutting edge green building, given that the challenge of converting a building. So we're going to talk about a lot about that over the next month, about those particular instances, but there's a number of those different types of relationships. I call them trade-offs, but they're really relationships and really understanding sort of what the ultimate goal is. So adaptive reuse, what needs to change? Just to be sort of direct, a lot of this is about embracing risk, right? As a county, we have a significant challenge. That means we have to do things differently. That means the process may feel a little bit different. We don't think the process that we will propose will be at its core unavailable for people to get their arms around and to work together to make work, but it's going to be a little different. Sometimes change is difficult, but we think the change is worth it. To do streamlined process, less reliance on policy guidance on building use, things that have been, quite frankly, been in the works for quite some time. We have the administrative guidance on office conversions that have been used by the site plan review committee and came out of, was originally started with the staff briefing to this committee, which already started to think about, well, some sector plans may have thought 20 years ago that needed this amount of office on the site, but is that really the reality of today's market? What is success? Well, clearly fiscal stabilization recovery. So I talked about trade-offs or relationships. the clear direction we got from our manager, and as we briefed the board on this as part of CMRI, and this is a major element of CMRI, was the primary focus was recovering the tax base, right? Taking those old office buildings and turning them into something that provides more revenues and less potential costs of managing sort of buildings in disrepair. So I don't want to hide that. That's a big part of why we're doing this. It's not the only reason, and we'll obviously try to move in, look at a lot of different potential success factors. Another one is innovative use of buildings. So I think there'll be a lot of just, the view of sort of, well, they'll just turn it into residential or turn it into hospitality. But as I mentioned before, doing that often requires a fair amount of innovation. And sometimes the product that comes out of it is truly innovative in terms of how amenities are provided. Some of the projects we toured out in Fairfax, because they had so much space in an underground garage, the amenity space is amazing. They had like an indoor dog park, not a dog run. It was like they had a dog grooming station that would match any private facility. Because they had the space and that was relatively cheap to put in. The point is that may set the standard for how people view apartment living and how the amenities that go into apartments. What are the risks? Again, change from the known level of community view potentially, but often clearly open for discussion. Forgoing spots of envisioned transformational change, once again, we'll talk about. And someone's asked us, well, what happens if you do all this work and nothing happens? My response is pretty simple, is that we're trying something. I don't predict how the market, I try not to predict how the market's going to work. What I want to make sure is that we're not a barrier to the market succeeding. If we do it and nothing happens, the first question I ask is, did we do enough to help the market in reasonable terms? But if it just changes, well, then we move on to something else that is an appropriate tool, right? It's as I said, it's just our time, right, to sort of think about these kinds of things. So while some people will say, well, how do you know there's going to be projects? Well, I know that we know of projects that are looking for this to happen. Are they all going to get to the finish line? I don't know, but if they don't, we'll think of some other way to solve the problem. So again, trying to go through this, I don't know what time check we have, probably way over time, but okay, I'll try to start opening up to questions very soon. So what does the adaptive reuse policy and regulations as we're going to propose look like? So we are creating a new process, and a lot of this we'll spend more time in our next meeting when we're going through the details. But it really is creating in the zoning ordinance. We have major site plan amendments, minor site plan amendments, admin change. This will be a fourth option that is a office adaptive reuse. So if someone says it's going to be a minor amendment or a major, well, it's going to be neither as defined. It's going to take elements of both potentially, but it's really going to define its own path, and that's for a lot of reasons, particularly clarity, but also because we already have a lot of, let's say, lack of clarity on what a minor and a major is to begin with. And we have a work stream working on that very difficult work for the entire ordinance. We want to make sure this has a clean opening slate. So right now it's only allowed per major site plan, as been said, which is time consuming and costly. As I said, the barriers to adaptive reuse requires the major amendment, section plan specificity. And then one that, certainly staff and I think a lot of the committee members and commission members know is our site plans are sweaters, right? You start pulling one thread and you get something else gets pulled in. And often why don't you just allow it by right? We looked at that. Well, the problem is these site plans are their own ordinance, and you really got to find ways to sort of come back to the county board with a legislative approval, but streamlining that approval so it still meets the need of timeliness. But you can't just sort of say, let's just ignore essentially a minor zoning ordinance for a particular site plan. I can talk a lot more about lessons learned, but in the interest of time, I'll just sort of highlight. They certainly across the region and even across the nation, but most particularly across the region, everyone has different processes, so the language doesn't always translate. But everyone looked at one area of their entitlement, at least one area of their entitlement process that they thought was a hiccup and solved it. So on Fairfax, it was what they call their comprehensive plan change, which is very typical of our sector plans, but that's a key part of their site plan review process, so they changed that. Uses, we've seen residential, hotel, by right uses in the ordinance are key. Once again, not by right amendment of the site plan, but by right uses. Criteria, we'll talk a little bit about criteria, although as we continue to look at criteria, people have had, well, the age of a building, the vacancy of a building. We have found that those have been not nearly as efficient or effective, because what we've seen, frankly, in most other jurisdictions, when they have like buildings built before 1970, building from 1972 will come, buildings have been built before 1972, like they keep on. And we really are ambivalent to sort of the condition of the building if the market wants to change it. What their age or vacancy or things like that. What we really want to look for is buildings that meet that we know are obsolete from an office perspective. So admin support, as in terms of implementation success, admin support is key, and admin consistency is the key. This is very inside baseball, but a number of jurisdictions would say it worked well until we realized that a new site planner had to learn the process every time a new one came in versus having one person that knew it. We are working very early with our building code official, because building code is 95% of this, quite frankly. Our land use is something we can solve, but how you actually change it and create and per building code is takes a wizard, and we have a wizard on staff. So that's good. And then financial incentives, our Economic Development Commission has released a document this year talking about financial incentives. We are considering them as part of the policy, but I can tell you they are not our highest priority right now. We want to focus on regulatory. A lot of this is our basic mantra that let's focus on things that don't cost us money out of hand, that solve money problems on the other end, but don't cost us dollars. And then if we have to look at financial incentives, potentially we'll do that. Although I think in most cases, even AED, which tends to be most involved in the incentive discussion, our view is if you're incenting someone that no one wants to do anyways, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And I think a lot of developers would even signal that if you have to pay me to do it, then it's probably not the right choice. It's really about sort of roughing around the edges. So it's something that we'll see in the list, but something we're not going to focus on as much in this first several months. As I said, streamlined process, a new guide, a new process. I get kidded all the time by the staff about this sort of like 100-day mantra. Don't take that too literally, but really what we're sort of saying is, minor site plan amendments take 3, 4, 5 months, major 6, 9 months. Really looking to do something just below that is more streamlined. Obviously, we can't bind a board or the county to approve or not in a certain time frame, but it's really just sort of a constant reminder of the need to think about this from a more streamlined approach. One of the things that will be filtered out that is I'll leave for further question and comment and discussion later on from tonight is the role of SPRC in the Planning Commission in reviewing these applications, because I think while I think the committee and the commission do a good job at processing information, that is another step in the process, and we have been asked, will the commission consider taking a different role in this regard? And that will be often, obviously open for discussion, but that's just something that I know. And we're looking at approved site plans. So if you're wondering, is it going to work in Columbia Pike? Not yet. The form-based code, it's not because it's overly complicated, but just it's another thing to do, and there's not that much of them on Columbia Pike today where they apply, and not by right. So again, if a by right building, we're not precluding because we think it's a bad idea. We're precluding it because you start to layer too much onto the workflow. It takes another year to solve everything. We may get to that next year if we see demand for that type of product conversion. Thresholds, we will look at thresholds, although we just had a discussion today about what there should be, like thresholds of what percentage of office use of a building should be considered, what percentage of office use that's being adapted for use should be considered. The reality is we just want to focus on buildings that we know are kind of office and getting them into alternative use, but we have seen proposals that have said I'll turn half of the building into residential and keep half office that's repositioned. So we've seen a lot of creative ideas that we don't want to preclude. An important one here is, and we try to say this as much as possible, is this process is not meant to change major community benefit assets associated with a site plan. So if someone comes in and says, I want to convert the building, and oh, by the way, I'd like to get rid of that park next to me. That's a different process. You go back to a major site plan amendment that's worthy of a more fulsome discussion, because that is changing the very nature of the site. So anything in the building like facilities, parks, transportation, those would not be considered as eligible changes under this process. So I talked about the role of the Planning Commission and SPRC in project review, obviously balancing the thoroughness and the certainty and timing. Obviously, you guys know this, so I won't go over it about sort of what happens relative to role of SPRC and PC in the county board, from administrative change to minor to different types of majors, where some majors are less major than others, for lack of a better term. And what we're really trying to do is find something in that sweet spot below minor in terms of timing, and we'll leave open to discussion sort of what that means for review. Policy, and then again, site plan standards. This we'll have a pretty well thought out in our administrative regulations, sort of what we're expecting out of these conversions in terms of green building, transportation, parking, so on and so forth. Things that in our current major site plan amendment are pretty well known, often still debated and discussed with developers, but pretty well known. The one question we get all the time from developers considering this or investors considering this is, I need to know going in what I need to submit to the county, but more importantly, what you're going to ask me to do. And don't catch me the 11th hour and tell me to do something wild to the building that blows my costs out of the window. So it doesn't mean less, or it doesn't necessarily mean reduced or less effective standards. It just means let's be clear about them and sort of really understand the trade-offs. And then additional density, I mentioned this. We never like to talk as density as a cost. It's really more of the method of earning it through this section of the zoning ordinance that allows the county board to modify density for public priorities. We would want to create a process, as I mentioned up front, where adaptive reuse created that, but have a list that really constrained what the board could consider for this type of process. And you see a list that's pretty exhaustive here that I mentioned up front. So it's not additional stories. It's not a building add-on that essentially adds a second building. It's not infill development. It's not any of that sort of stuff. Relationship to sector plans, I already mentioned about, I know our sector plans are often can be more or less prescriptive, some vary, some not so much, but still often refer to land use by site, by district, by sector plan area, a unit mix, often reflect on new infrastructure. The administrative guidance has covered part of this, and part of this will just be sort of continuing that conversation about how sector plans relate to this particular type of project that may come into the county. In relation to other county policies I mentioned, affordable housing, green building, commercial and residential parking policies, as a lot of these will result, because a lot of the older buildings were parked under very different standards and where more parking was required by the site plan, applying, say, current accepted residential parking rates to a lot of these buildings will leave a pretty significant amount of parking, existing parking, that is not needed for the use, but no one's going to tear it out. So you try to think about sort of how to balance that. And finally, not to, once again, we talk a lot about adaptive reuse, but a lot of the time I'm spending on the policy is really teeing up some of these other tools, such as building repositioning. Behind the scenes, as part of CMRI, we have, and I think this has been somewhat public, but for the most part, but we have a working group, a group that's working very hard on minor, major administrative definitions for all site plans. And we're going to look to collaborate that and maybe create a separate process, maybe not, for building repositioning. But it's one of the great frustrations I think we have of where a building that just wants to sort of reinvest in the building, think of Boston Exchange, right? And what that's done to that section of the street of Wilson. That took a lot of process to get to something that didn't change the use, didn't change the building form, just made it a better plaza and better retail environment. And trying to get around those processes. Other types of redevelopment that could remove obsolete office supply. I mentioned these, the adaptive reuse and also with significant amount of new density added, like additional floors or building additions. The redevelopment of an office building where major building elements such as parking or podiums are maintained. Pre-construction switches kind of a real estate term, but and we've seen a lot of these where sites that have been either by policy or by entitlement slated for office but not built, the developer comes back in and redesigns the building. And we've used the administrative guidance to sort of justify or have a conversation around the appropriateness of that. And then again, full redevelopment and the issue of community benefits and how we work through that is a much broader topic, but still one we will reference in the policy, but with the clear intention that that is a much more significant discussion for the county to have. So what is a study of future redevelopment considering, related to the structural development trends? We're looking at interest rate and cost of capital, cyclicality and stability. How is that affecting the ability to build certain product? Construction costs, alternative construction types like mass timber, how may that affect some decisions, and the ability to reuse office space, land costs and existing building basis, which unfortunately we're doing a very good job, but our building basis is going down. As I mentioned, you can now buy a building for $50 a square foot. That helps justify redevelopment. It doesn't help us until it is redeveloped. Community benefit costs and cost certainty. So this is something we're going to tackle as a policy guidance to study further for the most part. But again, a big question of how we look at community benefits. And then so on and so forth, impact of cost and revenue on redevelopment densities, which is a big factor. I don't know how much the committee and commission have gotten into this, but certainly as staff, we are looking at a change in how developers are approaching the county. And when they start sort of saying, hey guys, no problem, we'll cut our building size in half and go wood build, stick build, that may be good for, if say you were someone that didn't want that height, but for a production standpoint, that building's going to be there for 40 years and it's going to be at a density that's far less than that an approved sector plan thought. And that's going to have changed a lot of our metrics, right, on like how much housing production, how much commercial production we can actually accommodate in the county. And so we want to look at that, particularly as we look at reuse of office buildings. So same process, same discussions, but really tweaked for all these different processes and their complicating factors. What's the process? What are the regulations? What are the standards to apply? What is the level of community review, including the role of the commissions in this committee and commission, or the SPRC, I should say, as well as this one, but and methods for achieving additional density. So, promise, last slide or two. Process to November. So we have the September RTA. I mentioned next week we'll publication of a draft policy and any potential zoning ordinance changes. This is meant to be, this is a little different than we've done in the past, right? Typically we RTA it with a sort of pretty well-formed draft policy and language. This has been trying to get everyone to sort of, everyone gets to sort of see a little bit how the sausage is being made. So the draft being sent like next week is going to be well thought out, I think, but it's going to be really intended for open for discussion. And we're going to have a very robust October about discussing those documents and how we can continue to refine them from all stakeholder groups. And then obviously working on the admin regs, that doesn't have to necessarily 100% align with the board action, but we want to make sure by the end of the year we're able to start thinking about accepting applications is the ideal, or at least soon thereafter. Input can be provided prior to draft documents on our CMRO website. Future touch points, we did have a lunch and learn on July 31st, which, as I said, provided broad concepts on this. We have another lunch and learn that we think we'll do in mid-October. We'll call it a virtual public meeting since lunch and learn, we may not call it that, but it'll be something very similar. We're a virtual public meeting with a presentation and Q&A. As you know, we're obviously coming to the committees and commissions. And then we are going to do, this is not to leave out, this is not to say this is any more important feedback, but it is different type of feedback. We're going to do some developer and practitioner focus groups. Because I can also tell you, I understand real estate, but I don't understand a building systems from a green building standard and what's viable and what's not, and what's the impact on the energy. And so we're going to get real smart people that know that stuff to sort of say, okay, when I convert a building, I can actually do this stuff and it's not actually costing. It's part of my cost of doing business versus an additional cost. And what are the types? And then obviously the land use lawyers will talk about what the right process is, and we're going to take that and roll it into all the other feedback we've gotten. But I think it's a very important part of this very technical review of how we change maybe this part of the ordinance and our regulations. So LRPC discussion, I won't read all these because I'll just leave them on screen, but want to obviously spend the remainder of time tonight getting questions and feedback from you and anyone else in the meeting at the appropriate time. We'll be logging that in, and as we write the policy, continue to write the policy and continue to amend the policy, we'll be obviously cataloging those and following up with some responses. So with that said, sorry so long, but it's a lot of substance and wanted to get it all out.
I read through it ahead of time, and it's just a lot.
Yeah.
So going through it again, it's going to take all of us are gonna have to it's gonna take a lot for all of us to digest everything.
Yes.
Opened up to you guys. I already have a few things I wanted to touch base on. It strikes me, for example, that getting added density because of unneeded parking and elevators that we don't need, and maybe other mechanicals are more efficient, you don't need as much space. All that actually is a great incentive. We should not say, oh, you can't do that, you have to get rid of it somewhere else. I mean, it's sort of a non-monetary incentive that we can give that would have somebody rather redo the building than tear it down, because they're going to get more density than if they had torn it down. So that is a really, really good thing, I think. And I'd strongly support that, unless there's something I'm missing about unintended consequences. But it strikes me as it's like, it's money on the table that we can easily give. You sort of touched on sustainability requirements. Part of it is by not tearing something down, there's an enormous amount of embedded energy. The very fact of just adaptive reuse is environmentally friendly, period. Even if we don't get all the other bells and whistles, even if it doesn't go to, LEED Platinum, we're still getting a huge benefit by just not tearing the damn thing down. So I think we have to sort of balance that when we're looking what sort of incentives for sustainability. Again, less parking, that's environmentally friendly too. If you're doing that, and density itself is simply environmentally attractive. So you have these big picture environmentally good things that aren't the usual things that we think of when it's sustainability. So I'd like to keep that in mind in doing this. Yeah.
Well, just about the impact of added density, and it could kind of be a freebie. How much added density are we talking about, and what kind of impact could it have on the neighborhood? I could see if we were doubling the density, does that impact the local school? Does that impact fire department response times? Or like what is required? Do we need to add a new fire department if we had so much? Or is this going to happen in so few cases that there won't actually be that much impact? To other broader planning considerations.
Very good question. And on the particular adaptive reuse, we'll leave redevelopment as I said in the policy, introduced in the policy, but we've many more discussion with that. But for adaptive reuse, when we're talking about additional density, we are talking about pretty non-impactful in terms of how the building functions, right? So you may take that elevator shaft that Chairman Tillman mentioned, and you may use it for something else, but it's probably not going to be a residential unit, right? That'd be pretty weird residential unit.
But it may make it bigger.
Yeah, but maybe a bigger unit that's better, that has different.
We saw, just for an example, we saw what they did is they were able to take out one of the shafts and use that shaft for telecom closets. Again, still shaft. The other one they were able to take out and put in a floor, and that's where they have the collections for trash recycling and everything.
Yeah.
So it's being used efficiently, but it's not being used for residential.
And it's not excluded. And then there are other elements that when you walk by, you'll notice, like if they do like a ground floor, second floor bump out, right? But that impacts the neighborhood hopefully positively by having a better, more interactive ground floor environment. When we think of some of these older buildings, that's one of their biggest flaws, right? They're sort of very Stalinist in how they approach the street. So it's not going to be a significant impact on traffic or things like that. It's just other than the fact that more people are going to want to go to that building, but it's going to be part of an urban fabric.
Exactly. When I look at the building, it's right over here. That when we built those buildings in Columbia Village, those office towers, the one at the corner of Beach and Wilson, it's set back with the grass around it, and it's absurd. And that's where it's almost crying for a bump out that would bring the ground level out to the sidewalk on that heavily trafficked corner. It's like that's where you want the retail, where you want to go out there. And if there was an adaptive reuse to that building, I would strongly want them to do that. I want to have every incentive to make them do that rather than just, leave the building exactly as it is.
Yeah. So there will be thresholds, however. So one of the clear thresholds is, again, no new stories, no major building additions like you're adding a second building, right? I think where we are sort of working with the language is sort of to Commissioner Tillman's point of like, how big can the bump out get? Now, many buildings are already constrained by you can't bump out too far before you get into right of way, before you get into other
That's-
elements. Of the
Bump
site.
out to the right of way.
Yeah, exactly.
Bump out to the
But there are some that have so much setback that, you could imagine a pretty decent size. And I think we'll just have to work on the thresholds about, my intent of that is that adaptive reuse, to your point, and this is just my intent, not where we'll come out, is that we find a way to fit that in, right? Because that's a benefit to the project without changing we're not adding 100 more units. We're really just adding a better ground floor presence to the building.
Right, that's what I would envision for bump out. It's not that the whole building goes all the way up. It's just
Yeah.
first level.
Yeah, so we may say you can do a 1-story, 2-story addition, but you can't go up 10 stories alongside the building. Yeah.
Or you can.
Or you can, but it's a different process. That's the point.
Then it would be the major site.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe a new process that we create in the future, but not in
Not
November.
base.
Not this.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
hotel use sounds like it would be a really good idea, because hotel uses are along the lines of this. We need hotels, and those don't generate, they generate money and they don't generate costs.
Yep.
Because nobody lives in it. So, no school impact, none of that sort of thing. The sector plans you refer to, that's, I think, going to be really interesting, because we have sector plans that are brand new in the past few years, which presumably you still want to follow, and there's others that are 40 years old and are ridiculous, and
Yeah.
it's just not everybody. How are you going to deal with those radically different sector plans?
So we have thought about this, and this is the short answer, is that I can't imagine a situation that we sort of put something in writing that sort of said, just ignore sector plans.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's going to be it's going to be board policy guidance to itself about how and when it should consider potential relationships to sector plans, right? Which we did with the admin, but that obviously wasn't board policy. But even greater than that, I think it'll just provide guidance from this board to the next one that's considering this about sort of, it's okay to say we may change it, but be mindful of these sort of things, right? And so, yeah, I think that's always going to be, I think, a little bit of a case-by-case basis about what the part of the sector plan that you are potentially challenging with the new project. But also, adaptive reuse, we don't think is, while it extend the useful life of a building, it really will extend it by a very limited amount of time. Pretty much the life of the systems, right? The building's not going to fundamentally change, and that building eventually is going to. So when you think about an adaptive reuse project, you're probably going to see them come back in 30 years and sort of say, I'm going to tear it down or do something else, because the building is still going to be old. It's just the systems will give you another 30 years of breath into functioning of the building.
And the only other thing I had was, we have a lot of really old site plans, and obviously those are the buildings that are most ripe for the redevelopment.
Yeah.
Those site plans have a lot of weird stuff in them that we would never do today, or no one had paid attention to for years. And were mistakes when they were done, and this could be an opportunity to fix some of those really not good things in those. How are we going to be dealing with the existing?
Putting a driveway in front of the building, let's say?
Yeah, things like
Yeah.
that. Or the open space, which is 3 stories up and nobody knows is there.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we've described it as this is an opportunity. The reason why, again, we started off 5-6 months ago in very conceptual sort of studying, and we did study at great length sort of administrative paths, right? Because that was sort of a buzzword. People could go administrative and that'll be quicker. One, we don't know if that'd be quicker. 2 is we said, but that's a problem, because what about when you want to change the site plan? And isn't this an opportunity for an owner to sort of say, I'm going to start with a more streamlined process, but be able to get a fresh look at my site plan and site plan conditions, and get rid of all those old conditions that don't really match. So everyone is, I think, a lot of people on one side may be sort of saying they're worried about what the county is going to put as new requirements. We're sort of saying, but it's just as like we're going to take away old requirements that are actually harming your ability to reposition the building.
Or harming the community, period.
Yeah.
So if we had a fairly new sector plan and somebody comes forward and says, I want to do adaptive reuse, it goes against the site plan or the intended use for in the plan, but I want to do it anyway, and we're like, okay, fine, we'll let you do it.
Yeah.
And then 20 years later, they want to redevelop, and now they have a precedent to use that space for something different, or do we then hold up the sector plan and say, no, like the sector plan said this and we gave you a pass, but now 20 years later, you got to go back to the plan.
So as we always say, sector plans at the heart are board policy. They can decide whether they want to agree or disagree with their policy at any point. They can at one time disagree with it, and the next time, sort of for different reasons, agree with it. I will say that some of our newer sector plans, and this is part of what the lessons learned, our newer sector plans generally are not prescriptive use for this very reason, that we've learned from really the 2000s generation of sector plans that were sort of saying this has to be office, residential, that we were coming back constantly and having to have this discussion. So most of our newer sector plans may set targets or expectations, or at least some, but like the Pentagon City sector plan doesn't really dictate use as much as others do. Even Crystal City, which is not new anymore, but talks about block level mixes, but not necessarily site level. So I think I'm probably missing one or two examples, but I think in most of our newer sector plans, we're not. I mean, Tasha, you can talk about Plan Langston Boulevard, right? It's like I think we tried not to be like very prescriptive on use for that very reason, so we didn't have to then sort of guess later about what the intent of that board was. Was it strong intent? Was it kind of a just looks good in a map type of thing?
Yeah, if you think about all of our meetings of the past few years,
Yeah.
we as a body ever said, well, gee, that's residential, shouldn't that be an office building or
Well, we did
opposite?
have, with Plan Langston Boulevard, there were like corners, and like at the corner, we need to have a restaurant. We can't
Right,
have
we
a
want
gym,
more
like we
retail.
specified.
Right,
uses
we've done
in
that,
certain
exactly.
places. Yeah.
So that would still be part of this, but the larger, where does the residential go, where does the office go, and what's the major use? I mean, having it be multi-use is probably going to be continuing,
Yeah.
but definitely the hotel, office, residential, that we've never really discussed that at our table.
Yeah, and the ground floor treatment, I think what we found, I'm sorry, I even had your hand raised. The ground floor treatment, when we talk with developers, is probably the least of their concerns. Either they want to upgrade it because it's deficient, it doesn't have any ground floor, or we talked to a lot of folks and said, I'm not touching the retailer. Are you kidding me? I got a 10-year lease with a great operator. I'm not kicking that person out. Like, it's not a construction project. We can build around them. Like, we can hammer around them, so.
And where we have had discussions, it's been at that ground floor, whether
Yeah.
the retail is appropriate there, because we've had sector plans that said retail here. We've, as a body, looked and said, wait a minute, is it going to succeed there? Do you really want to have retail there? Aren't you just creating a vacancy, a forever vacancy? We've had that discussion a number of times on projects.
So basically, when it comes to this, if I'm understanding it right, so regardless of whether the site plan or sector plan was created, recently as Plan Langston or as old as like the 1940s.
Boston's our old.
1980.
Whatever it is, we're just going to sort of say, all right, well, whatever the board says now by the time it's redevelopment is what we're going to go with. Is that kind of how I'm understanding?
No, I think what works is, how it happened is this will still be a application to amend a site plan, right? And that'll go through, it'll be a new process, yes. It'll be a new process, but it will still be an application to amend the site plan. And as with all those things, planning staff will then look and sort of say, what are the guiding principles and policies related to this site, right? And so they would acknowledge that if the site if a sector plan said this should be office, and someone says, I want to change that office building to hotel or residential, they would acknowledge that discontinuity. All that then do is become a topic of conversation, and ultimately for the board. So there would be no standard, I'm understanding your question correctly, there'd be no standard sort of like where it would be the same path as any other amendment. It would just be done perhaps more streamlined.
Just wouldn't be as binding as before.
No, I mean, every site plan, but every board action is binding to the site plan.
The site plans themselves are no longer as binding when it comes to this specific type of adaptive reuse.
Yeah, I don't know if binding is the right word. I think every site plan, when it's amended, becomes the new binding legal requirements of that site, right? I think what it does is that the way you get there would be acknowledgement by the board of being more flexible on what they're binding that site to.
Right, so instead of, because this is a specific process that we use for adaptive reuse, it does not have to go through the process, but the end result is the same.
Yeah, it goes through a different process. It
Right.
still goes through the process, which is
Right.
that there'll be public notice, there'll be It'll be a public hearing for the county board. Once again, open topic is what the role of the commissions will be. All those are open. There may still be a requirement not a requirement, but an encouragement to meet with the community that the building is in, those sort of things, right? So it'll go through a lot of the same process. I think the streamlining is really around the edges of how you look at, and a lot of it's back of house, right? Like I think I've talked about the role of an SPRC, maybe adding time versus not, right? But not necessarily, but I think, just in terms of calendar scheduling sometimes does, right? But a lot of it's just about staff review and about what we're asking the developer to submit to us and what we're having to review and what we are looking to review. So a new site plan will look at the entire transportation network, right? And we have a months review, maybe for this one's, and I'm not going to speak for our transportation friends because we haven't decided that, certainly, and I'm not going to decide it. But there may be a more streamlined way of thinking about what's the impact on transportation because the building's already there, right? And uses change transportation, but is it really how much around the edges? If it's one or two here or there, it's not an entire district changing. So
in essence, though, basically, like if you're climbing up a mountain, the old way, you had to go through the site plan amendment, climb up by hand and everything, and this sort of gives you a little escalator that takes you right to the top.
Sure.
You hit a lot of the same points, but it's a little bit faster, a little bit easier to do if you're.
Yeah, I think what's streamlined, I think what the crux of the discussion will be, like tonight and for other discussions will be, streamlining shouldn't mean sort of ignoring or sort of like, sort of saying, we're just not going to worry about that, right? If you're not going to worry about it, it has to be intentionally that you're not worried about it. That you sort of say, these are the things that we are not going to focus much time on because we are willing to accept a level of risk that things could go one way or another. And I think the county has, in its processes, has always had, some processes are much longer and more complicated because the level of risk the county board is willing to accept is relatively small, right? It really wants to know down to X what's going to happen. And that's just the legislative decision. This would be a discussion with them about whether they're willing to accept that as they're going up that mountain, that they're not going to worry about, well, that looks like it's going to be an avalanche in 10 years. It's like, move on. That's, like I said, up to ultimately the board and their advisor commissions to help them guide. Yep.
So since this is going to be more like a major site plan amendment, but with an escalator, we are foregoing the community benefits that we would have gotten. There wouldn't be any community benefits associated with an adaptive reuse. So if there's like a street network plan, change new bike lanes, that's going to be delayed for another 20 or 30 years.
So I will answer that in a couple ways. One is that I think many of these, if we look at the nominal density I discussed earlier and have a path where you don't have to provide community benefits to earn that the priority is for that relatively small amount relative to a new construction, which is the entire, usually half the building is community benefit earned. That would not be those extra community benefits, right? Now, I think things like streetscape standards, transportation networks are all part of the discussion that we'll be having now into October, November with staff about, and then obviously publicly with what are the standards we're trying to approach there. So
That includes base affordable housing.
yeah, so I think base affordable housing, I think we're going in with the assumption that buildings that already exist don't have to pay potentially again the base affordable housing.
They already have.
If they already had, but also many people say, well, what if they haven't?
The older ones.
Yeah, but I think this may sound a little crafty, but the way I've phrased it is they paid what the ordinance required at the time, even if there wasn't an ordinance. And I think I think we may also find developers that sort of say, in the grand scheme of things, we're willing to pay X into affordable housing. That's not, we're going to test what is the financial viability. I think some of the things that you mentioned, I think, are where we just need to be very transparent and upfront and clear going into an application of what we're going to expect. Like if a existing site needs intersection upgrades that have been on the books a long time, are we going to require this adaptive reuse to pay for that like we would if it was new development, right? Or at least we'd ask as part of the development process. I think it's all around sort of like what is the devil's in the details of what those sort of mean, right?
I mean, theoretically, the county's going to do better anyway, just because it's going to increase the ratables for the building if it's done.
Yeah, we'll get tax
And
revenue.
we get then paid for that bicyclists.
Yes, you speak, you could join us at over AD, Jim, because I think that's what we always say is that we do get taxes for these things, and we do have taxes to pay for these. But I think it's a fair point of what comes with development and whatnot, and I think it's hard to answer black and white about these today, what's exactly going to happen, but I think it's,
Yeah. I was gonna say also on that point too, it's, because again, I always say this, but my full-time job is across the river building the capital improvement plan, and when we lose this tax revenue, it really hamstrings our ability to fund stuff. And with the additional revenue that comes from this, I'm assuming the logic is that this is in and of itself a community benefit because it restores our tax revenue.
that is
That allows us to move more strategically and long-term thinking with our money, as opposed to these developers who just do like a bike lane improvement here. Now we can do the entire streetscape.
Yeah, not only that is that, we often try to, when we elevate this conversation, absolutely, that is the first premise, which is that the recovery and growth of tax base then provides a revenue source to be able to pay for some of these things and doesn't rely on development cycles, right? And one of the things when people talk about trade-offs, well, I don't, if they say, well, I want affordable housing in this adaptive reuse, or I don't want to have that adaptive reuse. Well, the reality is that you're assuming that project's going to happen with if it doesn't happen because that financial burden doesn't allow the project to succeed, you're not going to get either the affordable housing or the increased tax base. It's going to stay an old office building. Right. And so we're trying to be very thoughtful about how we have that conversation because it's very complicated, but it is the basic premise of the most direct way that we know to create revenues for things like capital projects is to increase our annual tax base. That's the most stable funding that we have. Development contributions always work when they work. They don't work when development doesn't happen for 5 years, right? And no one's providing into that.
Another important thing to remember is an empty building isn't just a drag on itself and its owner. It's a drag on the entire area around it because if there's nobody in that building, those retailers around it that were depending on that don't do as well. We've seen that in Crystal City where there's a number of those like see-through buildings, and they're really not good. They're not good for that area. We really don't want to have ghost buildings.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. I've been quiet this whole meeting. Everyone said several times, so I'm going to turn. First of all, apology for coming late. This is super juicy, and I'm super into this, and I really appreciate you guys doing great work here. I will try to support it as much as I can. Having said that, I have a few I have a ton of things that are totally disorganized. And I repeat Commissioner Lantelmi's thing. This is really meaty. And it's, I think this rush schedule puts a serious burden on us to sort of try to understand what is a very big bite you're taking out of the apple here. So again, I appreciate you and I will try to support you, but we are going to have to trust you to a large extent that we're sort of representing the community's interest. A quick plug-in for SPRCs. Our SPRCs have become very efficient, very streamlined, and very positive. I know that there were SPRCs that used to have 6 meetings back in the day, and used to go till midnight and so on. So, we really have trimmed down the SPRCs. So that's just, a little plug for the community side of the conversation. And SPRCs only drag down when developers are being onerous and difficult. So there's a little bit of a sort of like the metric, right, is telling us what we need to know. This is a bad project. Right, and the reason the SPRC is being problematic is because it is, you see what I'm saying? It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in that sense, I'm happy to talk about SPRCs expediting the process. I don't want to lose the oversight aspect, right? So I think we're happy to work with staff and devise, but you yourself said it, this is more back of house stuff, less SPRC, so I feel a little bit of comfort from that. I think that's a good thing. As much as we can.
Can I just ask, just to clarify, and for folks here, for projects that have gone through like a very efficient, streamlined SPRC process, do you find once it gets to the planning commission, the conversation is just almost nil? It's like, it could almost be like a consent item.
Yes, we've had planning commission meetings where the most recent one that came through was the one on Wilson Boulevard and the roadside grill.
Oh,
MSTA. Yeah.
That PC discussion went through in like 10 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, we had less discussion than the presentations took. It zoomed through because it was so thoroughly vetted. It was a really good project.
Which
that-
illustrates my point,
Yeah.
right? Good applicants get treated very well, right? Bad applicants, we then start stomping our foot. It takes the SPRC long for us to talk through because we're trying to, twist their arms to do the right thing. It goes to the planning commission. We have lengthy conversations at the planning commission because everybody want to take a whack at this piñata. So again, like, it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And in that sense, I feel very satisfied and feel very proud of the SPRC process. And again, I'm just putting a plug in, and it has become, I think, a really useful and I think cooperative tool, particularly with staff. We work with staff. So that's my 2 cents on the SPRC. The one thing is to go back to that conversation, if you guys can, as you farm this out to the commissions, create this outline and almost help us walk through all the salient points that need to be talked about and/or you are specifically looking for feedback for, because otherwise, we're going to get I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. My notes are all over the map, right? So as much as you can bring, I think you will find we spend less time in these meetings and yet you get good response.
You're describing my desk right now as I'm writing the policy. I'm getting notes
There you go.
everywhere. No,
and
very, very fair point, and certainly something I think we can, and as we get closer to the commissions and the board, I think we know we have to start really teeing up the key decision factors with some good upfront information and then.
Hang on, I still have more.
But I want to reinforce what he just said about SPRCs. It is a community process, and be really careful that we don't end up in a situation where larger communities says, whoa, you're rushing things through, it's a gift for developers.
Yep.
There's that strain of thought out there that you have to be careful you're not going to be stirring up.
Perfect, that cues up my next point. I cannot congratulate you, thank you, appreciate your developer practitioner focus group. I wish we had had that in the missing middle conversation also. At the end of the day, we need these people on the table, right? We're trying to provide them what they need. We're trying to give what we need. As much as we can have their voice be articulated early on in these process, I really, really, really appreciate that. And I think that helps us leverage the density or whatever, instead of giving it away. I'm sort of reflecting a little bit on Commissioner Lantelmi's issue where we're like, we can give this. I'd rather trade, right? And yes, I understand all the empty offices and how that's worthless, but I really want us to be savvy, barterers of the density that we're giving away and the stuff. Of course, the community benefit of, and this is preaching to the choir, but it's my axe that I grind. Any structure that we preserve sets us so much further ahead on the green building thing. So that is a no-brainer. I think otherwise, I had a bunch of notes in here. This is something that, going back to like Virginia Square, I think was the last time we had this conversation about like what is the balance between office versus residential, And I think this is sort of a question that I keep coming back to, and I don't know that we'll ever get to. This is almost like a think tank thing, but any sort of criteria that you can come up with your sort of economic development, so that we can think, or know how to think about a building that's being developed, right? And yes, I think you're right. Being prescriptive and saying we need 50-50 or 45-55, I think that just doesn't allow us to sort of understand the nuance of each different sector and so on and so forth. So I think anytime that you can sort of say, here's, an ideal economic for a micro block, what you want for 24-hour sort of, urban activity type thing.
So along those lines, and I think this gets to some of our really old sector plans.
Right.
They were done at a time where you lived where you lived, you worked where you worked. And the reason to have that mix was to ensure during the day you had a population, during the night you had a population. But now people work where they live almost all of the time.
Because the tower is also an office building.
Yeah.
And my concern there is the pendulum swing, right? Like for a while there we were all office. Now we're sort of swinging a little bit towards all residential due to market forces and a lot of our sort of housing enthusiasm. Again, like, is there some criteria? Is there like a threshold line that we really ought to start thinking like, okay, too much, right? And again, I know that that's a really tricky perpetual.
Yeah, we have talked about it from a very theoretical and then down to a practical standpoint. I'll put it this way. I think what we may need to think about is changing the word use to activity. What activity? A building is just sticks and stones, right? The question is what activity occurs in that building? And that's where Jill was pointing out that certainly even before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic accelerated like light speed was people just live differently because most people have a home office now that they never had, right? And when you start to replicate that, and one of the things we learned about, once again, as an example of lessons learned from other places was the Skyline project in Fairfax. Fairfax created, and we are considering, although it won't be the same timing as this exactly, but whether we need to start talking about live-work concepts, and not live-work as the classic townhouse where you live and work above. But what they did in Fairfax, they put that in their zoning and essentially said, this building, every unit can be either office or residential. The building code is going to be applied to the most restrictive of each of those uses. But the units are going to be so flexible in terms of how they can be used. And what they found there is that, like the vast majority of people that rent those units live in there, but they use the spaces very different from one unit to the other. Some sleep in there and have a bed on the side, are there 3 days a week where they live somewhere else, but they have a big part of the space is offices where people can come in and meet with them, right? Versus some treat it very much like residential with a little cubby. The whole point is the activity that's occurring in there is what drives the daytime population, because in Ballston, we always say Ballston was the pandemic sort of winner, if there was a winner, only because that 50-50 residential, people living in Ballston were now working in Ballston because they were working from home and they were going out to get lunch anyways.
In the district, the way the zoning works, there are apartment buildings in the district that are exactly that. It's a classic apartment building. But there are people that live in this unit, and then this unit is a therapist's office, and this unit is a small business. And this unit is a residential one, all on the same floor, all right next to each other. It's completely mixed inside the building, and to outside it looks just like an apartment building. But the uses are all over the place.
So while that live work concept is definitely part of this discussion, not necessarily part of the action, it's to your point, which is that if there's a discussion of what the right mix is, we'd like to start changing it, what the mix of activity is. And are we being creative about how we're allowing buildings to be used from activity? And then the market will determine sort of places being active, because people will decide that building maybe, as Jim said, it may look like an apartment building, but maybe people that are having businesses, or like I said, the telework issue or the people working from home issue is a real thing. That is no longer just I work from home every now and then. It's sort of like people have set schedules and they live in their apartment buildings and in their neighborhoods like it's an office district.
And that brings us to Jill's point, the 5% rule. I guess that's a longer term process that we would start to address, right?
Well, we don't need to address it here because we're going to create a new process that goes around it.
Well, but we should go back to zoning, right? Flag that as a zoning issue to come up and say, like, are these percentages obsolete?
And so that, as Mark pointed out, part of it's referred to now as the MMA work. And it's not mixed martial arts, though at any given time it might feel that way. I think that's
Ideally, you could build in mixed martial arts instead.
Yes.
One of these places.
So, but the way that the major amendment is classified in our zoning ordinance does state that the principal use of the building would change in more than 5% of the total floor area of the building. And that's fairly, it's a
very
low
minimal,
number.
right?
Very low.
Right. And then I had another point that I wanted to make. Perhaps we not say this out loud on the age of the building in the 30-year window. If you encapsulate that building, with a new facade and, like you said, put in new systems, you could potentially see the longevity of the building go beyond.
I know I know you as an architect were going to say, no, actually, we can make these buildings last longer. I understand your point completely, but I also think that
From Massachusetts, we have like hundreds-year-old
Right.
buildings,
right.
so I'm always like.
but they weren't built in 1960. That's the thing. So we stopped building them.
The Woolworth building was built in 1912. It now has condos in it. It is adaptive reuse. It's 120 years old. It's still there and not going anywhere. So
not to get too out, but we stopped building buildings. We started building buildings differently in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, more commodity buildings, which makes it why you don't see many of these buildings sort of be like, oh, that's an old building that has like this certain level of
Now,
adaptability,
actually,
right? And we're trying to,
drop the density, because Manhattan has one big office building that's adaptive reuse, and they turned it into a Dallas donut by just
yeah,
eliminating the entire interior.
yeah,
So it's a big, big circle.
Yeah.
everywhere.
To get the core, yeah.
Yeah, so that could happen.
yeah.
Which of course, sorry, both Commissioner Lantelmi and I have bemoaned the 2+5 construction that was allowed a few years back. And like that has been the bane of our sort of development, because now you're getting a lot of this truncated thing, which like you said, some neighbors appreciate that, but we are leaving a lot of density on the table.
Yeah, you don't get that density back for generations, right?
So, I really like that you're sort of flagging that and that we're looking at ways to incentivize,
Yep.
more sturdy, more long-lasting construction essentially, to go back to they don't build them like they used to, sort of.
Yeah, because we are seeing, and not to overdo the point, but just to sort of put a period on it. I mean, we're seeing people that are looking at tearing down 10-story office buildings to build 2 over 4, right? I mean, they're actually reducing the density of the building, not just matching it. And that's where you start to get into sort of like, all right, has some benefits, I guess, or has some different sort of impacts on, but I think in general, it doesn't meet sort of our relatively limited amount of land we have for urban density.
Holiday Inn was the first one that came in.
Yeah.
What? You're not building to
Yeah.
density you're allowed? What's going on?
Yeah.
Tearing down a big hotel.
Yeah.
Finally, sorry, one last point. No, I really hogged the microphone. To go, all Maynard Keynes on this conversation, like, is this a good time for the county to all of a sudden start putting some chips on the table, and picking up some of these real estates? I know this is way outside the lane here, but, it's a time for the county, whatever. Like I said, I'm outside. This is an economic sort of conversation. But as much as we can float a balloon and start to get the board and start to get economic development thinking about real estate investment, I know we don't have a sector, we don't have a department, blah, blah, blah. But, I always bemoan that we don't have a proper housing department, that we can sort of point to and say, we need your help with this. Anywho, pie in the sky situation, but still. Okay, I'm done.
So I was wondering, how many buildings are eligible? I feel like conversations I've heard are that there's 10.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think we know of 3 or 4, maybe 5 buildings that we know we have active conversations with developers that are looking at it. And when I say active, I mean, it's not just they're sort of like, they've done some due diligence, they can show us concept plans, so they've put some effort into it. Really 3 to 4, maybe, and 5th one kind of is ramping up. But in total, yes. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention, once again, if you believe this was a cut down version of a presentation, but we could talk, we can certainly talk, and we talk in the policy to a certain extent about, there are limiting factors to the size of this opportunity, right? Because most office buildings just don't have the footprints and ceiling heights, particularly like inefficient footprints you can try to work around and you can get creative, but low ceiling heights, you just end up building a product that isn't marketable for residential. And things like windows and light and air, you end up not being able to, no one wants to live there, and therefore so we think it's definitely in a couple of handfulls over the next 5 years or so. And that most of the activity we'll still see will be sort of redevelopment in some form to overcome those innate challenges. But that's kind of the point, right? Let's hit the iron while it's hot on this one. In 5 years, maybe not be talking about adaptive reuse nearly as much, because we'll have sort of taken all the opportunity and the market has transitioned those. But right about the same time, we'll be fully formed on sort of other tools we'll be using for redevelopment or other things. So
I think you've also said that those handful, those 10 or so that could be adaptively reused does make a dent into the office supply that we're trying to get rid of.
Well, so like just as an order of magnitude, so people say, well, that's, like 2 projects. Well, one project, a couple of projects that we know in the hopper would remove almost 1 million square feet of office from the market and add either residential or hotel, hundreds, if not 1,000 units. And so 1 million square feet of office off our market, where 42 million square feet is a significant, as we call it, denominator play with the vacancy rate, right? And more importantly, it's taking very desperate office off the market. And so someone will say, well, so if it may only be 5 or 6, but that 5 or 6 could be several million square feet of office space that can go to an alternative use that then serves other purposes like housing production, hospitality, recovery, which we know is a big challenge for our department and for the county, which is how do we get hotel rooms back into play, because the demand is coming back and we need to have the hotel rooms to serve them. So
I wanted to come back to process. You mentioned consent items, and that's where my mind was going.
Yeah.
In terms of like an SPRC or Planning Commission review. It's something we have in DC with our federal transportation contracts. We have this thing called the Plan of Contracts. Basically, all of our federal things, they can get put together in one big package, submitted to the legislature, and they just sort of do a quick review on their own time. They blanket review it sort of during their sessions, and then we move on. So I think maybe something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think we can pack these together, where the review is more back of house, like we do it on our own time, and then we bring up issues if we see them, and if we don't, we just move it along. Because the whole point is to make this move quickly, but there's still the oversight element. The public can still get involved. We can still get involved if we see an issue with it.
Yeah.
But,
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because the timing has to work. I've already talked to folks that we've talked in confidence about projects. And I said, it'd be great if all you guys get together in one room and sort of decide this is when you're going to start, this is when you want to go to SPRC, and have like one SPRC with all 5 of, like at once.
Yeah.
Because I do think that, and this is just not a response, but just a clarification. I certainly am reflecting that SPRC is much more efficient now than it ever was. It's just a matter of not only the scheduling and the calendar, but also you may find out that these projects aren't doing enough to really, you'll sit there instead of say, all right, we came out of our house and met for this, like what are we reviewing? Like there isn't much to review since it's so much just internally focused. So we could find ways to sort of say, we're not removing a level of public review to sort of avoid it, but more of, is it really necessary to move the project along and still have a sufficient community review? That's really only the question we're asking, people continue to ask. But I agree, it'd be great if we could sort of say, let's bundle these together, and a number of them, and have again, timing notwithstanding, where there may be some projects that are more time sensitive, have once a quarter or something, where it's like sort of, there's one SPRC meeting that just looks at sort of 3 or 4 applications up until they run out.
And somebody's waiting
Right.
3 months.
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah, well, that's the only point is, we're seeing with timeliness, we're seeing there's a tremendous amount of pressure about getting something on the books that provides a clear path, right? Then that is always different than someone sort of saying, well, what's it going to take me to negotiate good financing, right? Their point is, without anything on the books with a clear path, I can't even approach my financing. If there's something in the books that gives me a clear path, I can approach financing. Now, it may take me 3 months, 6 months to get financing, and so I agree. We would never do it and sort of say, you have to wait 3 months because you just came in, or you were in first, but we had to wait until, the train's full before it leaves on time, right? But it was more of a pipe dream. It would be great if that worked out. So your time could be used efficiently as well at SPRC, which is that, can you review things?
And the consent agenda works for that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and the consent agenda is obviously from the board's perspective, and I know we've talked in theory about a consent agenda for the planning commission even. But at the board, that's really, it's a month by month determination by the chair about sort of what items sort of need full public review. I wouldn't be surprised if the first couple of these that go through don't go in consent, just because I think there'll be a desire from the board to talk about them. But that doesn't concern us from a process standpoint necessarily.
Have you thought of giving this presentation to CivFed?
Yes. Ms. Bodine is on the line, I saw, and we are just finalized October 17th. We're going to housing.
Very good.
Maybe there's like a re-SPRC, since it's a project that's already approved, there's like a mini subcommittee from the Planning Commission, SPRC. I mean, this is way outside money and bandwidth, but, maybe we can talk about setting up almost a slightly, representative, like you said, instead of going home, there's a quick little meeting with the SPRC chair saying, yes, this meets this criteria. We can just stamp this, we'll present it at the Planning Commission, but it's already been approved. And again, just thinking out loud.
Yeah. Again, I think this is what we'll lead this up to since this is obviously the commissions are not staff led, we support you. This is really with the commission itself is the issue of calendar is probably the one that probably gives everyone, like, there's sometimes a backlog, right? And you never hear anything here, we're gonna let people skip a line, right? This is not sort of go in front of others, because that's obviously, so, creative ideas like that, is there a subcommittee of the subcommittee that sort of can react more quickly and say like, okay, we're gonna meet next week and go over to this relatively easy, but sort of still important to review process to give our recommendation to PC?
Meeting with more than 2 of us, we have to
Well, it'd be a public,
publicize it.
right.
Yeah. 2 weeks in advance. Yeah, but it'd be 2 weeks, but I mean, I don't know how much, but I think it's gotten better, but I think there are times when we have such heavy site plan flow where months before a new project can even get us SPRC day, right? Or is that still not a problem?
Though to be fair, we're doing this because we don't have a
Well,
massive backlog of
yeah,
site
yeah,
plans.
that's
So
true.
We've got some space.
That's true. It's a happy coincidence, not a coincidence, it's a happy,
Yeah, but
Or
also,
cause and effect,
yeah,
right?
we also had months where we've had 3 planning commission meetings.
Yeah.
We knew so many things
Yes.
coming
Yeah.
up,
Right.
and we did not want to carry them over.
yeah.
So we will
Yeah,
meet,
yeah.
get things figured out. You
Well,
know,
I will leave that discussion with you as a body to have amongst yourselves, because I think, once again, we want to raise it as just the overall question of where the process lies. I think, as I said, the commission has its own role relative to its advisory to the board, and the committees are part of that function. So we're happy to talk with you about it and sort of understand your thinking on it.
Speaking of the axe grinding thing, this is a little bit more for this crowd, less for that crowd. But, as we review SPRCs, right, to future-proof for some of these adaptive reuses, right? And I've said this in past meetings, like, instead of banked parking, if you make them level with ramps, that just makes it that much more easier to potentially repurpose that.
Yep.
And then a conversation we had with the Amazon, which is now on hold, which of course is the problem we're talking about. But they have these massive floor plates, right? And one of the things is you can't convert massive floor plates into apartments, whereas skinnier proximity to window sort of factor floor plates in buildings are much more easily reused. So if we can, as we get these applicants coming through, give them a little push and say, hey, can you do some of these things for us? So that we
Exactly. Though even the buildings that have what seem to be floor plates would work, they want to tear it down. The project on Wilson Boulevard in Highland,
Yeah.
that apparently was a by right, so, there's no site plan on there. But the building really could be converted. It has high ceilings, it has narrow floor plates, the garage is already there, there's space that you could build another thing next to it. You just want to tear the whole thing down. It's like, really?
So this may be, if someone's listening from the development community, but I think what we found is we're trying to solve the regulatory process because we want to open up the marketplace.
Yeah.
I think if working real estate for over 30 years, I think what is a truism always is there are going to be folks that are early adopters of any industry and then folks that are late adopters. And there's still folks that sort of say conversion never work, right?
So that's,
And it's the ones that sort of saying, I know how to make it work, and I'm gonna make a killing at this.
Right.
And that's fine that you're the last one that thinks it doesn't work.
Mhm.
I'll buy the building from you, and I'll do it. So I agree, there's still gonna be instances where sort of that building would have been a candidate, but it just didn't have the right ownership or capital around it. But it doesn't, but more and more, we're gonna see pressures in the marketplace of those that figure out how to do it are gonna be active players in the market and are gonna be competing for these types of assets that do work.
also, and this is what I'm interested in, like what other communities are doing this?
Yeah.
Where are they in the process and like the building code stuff? Because I've heard that the adaptive reuse becomes very, very expensive when you have to add plumbing for the entire
Yes.
building that was originally commercial, and
Yes.
that's often, and the sprinkler systems, and so I guess, what other communities are doing this? What are we learning from them, and how are they making this attractive from a building code perspective?
Yeah. So our 2 neighbors, Fairfax and Alexandria, have had significant activity in this. They have both changed regulations to do so. They also have different environments. So it really started with Alexandria on the waterfront, which sort of typical loft conversions, which were simpler, and that's been a tried and true. Take an old industrial loft around the waterfront, and the waterfront turns out to be a pretty nice place to live, and you get the nice cost of a condo that can support that. But they've obviously evolved and are doing a lot more. There's one in Carlin Springs that's now 4 or 5 years old now. That's an old GSA building. And Fairfax has done it. So they've started with the regulations. And as I said in the slide very quickly, so I'm not surprising, wasn't fully understood, but they really, each jurisdiction looked at sort of like, what did they think was the sort of like thing in their process that was was creating sort of concern about timeliness, right? So every process, Alexandria, Fairfax, and Arlington is different. At its core, it's the same, but in terms of how we call things and how we go through, it's very different. And so we have tried to do the same thing. What is the elements of the process that can speed it up versus, I think, and so they've seen a lot of success. I think Alexandria has the most, like over 50 or something like that now at this point. A lot of those smaller buildings, and now that some of these Fairfax, the one that's getting the most publicity now is their developer is buying a number of the Skyline buildings, and he's already opened one. And he's talked to us for many years about adaptive reuse in Arlington, and I'll just say he's also someone who says I'm proud to say I've figured out the code and I can do this. But we have a lot of those folks around. So I apologize if I forgot the second part of the question, but there is a lot of I think the second part of the question is where are they now? I think the good news is we may have been a little bit late to the party initially adopting this sort of stuff, but we've had the benefit of learning. They're now in sort of generation 2, right? They're sort of trying to apply what they learned to redo their regulations. And we've had great conversations with Alexandria and Fairfax on the city side, not just on the government side, not just on the developer side. And yes, they'll sort of say, we've learned a lot. Maybe the first one wasn't so easy, and we've learned some of these things that can help the streamline process. So we're benefiting from learning along with them and maybe coming out of the chute a little bit.
DC opened its first office to residential conversion a few months ago.
Yeah.
So they're ahead of us too.
Yeah, so DC, I never want to not mention DC, but DC is a bit of a stranger animal for a lot of reasons, including just how their land use regulations work. But yes, DC is obviously has been most, I would say, interventionist as a government, including talking about financial resources and other things. Yeah, to really make widespread change. They also operate at a different scale, right? So they look at it and sort of say, 1 million square feet, we need to do it. Like we need 20 million square feet converted in the next 5 years, right? So we understand why they look at it differently. But yes, there's a lot of activity over there as well. Often very difficult floor plates where folks are trying to figure out how to make it work.
And with the district, I mean, Washington is the company town for the U.S. government. So
Yeah.
the fact that they've scaled down so significantly the government footprint there, that's really spurred on the big push over there. So luckily, like you said, we've had that little bit of, we're not as reliant on the federal government and other players like that to be here the way that they are. So we've luckily been able to take our time, but they've had to be very aggressive about it.
Yeah.
So you said one of the goals, or what does success look like, recover the tax base. Are we going to do that with 10 buildings?
Well, it'll certainly on those buildings, but certainly if you think about, we have some, I won't quote them off the top of my head, but just as an order of magnitude, if you look at, essentially taxes are 1%, they're a little more higher now, but 1%. So $500 a square foot versus $50 a square foot is 10 times. You're talking about millions of dollars a year in tax over just 5 or 10 buildings, maybe more. And the secondary effect is what it does to the broader office market, right? You take these lagging, inefficient, poorly performing buildings that are dragging down the market, and you let, for lack of a term, the top of the market breathe more and get more aggressive on attracting the right tenants that will attract the price. So their values are going up. And it sort of is so we've done the sort of looking at the value change and understanding the order of magnitude. I think, for me, I don't think there's a sort of set number that makes it a good idea versus bad idea. I think as we look at the budget season every year, we know that every $100,000 counts to our budget, right? And certainly every $1 million counts to our budget. So even if there's just a couple of these, Mark can look at it and sort of say, well, that actually changed something that was X and Y, and now I can, go do something that is on the top of my list for community support, whether all the things that we're obviously dealing with as a community that need more resources.
But I'll say just long-term, right? Like allowing and opening the venue for adaptive reuse, it's just a good thing.
Yeah, and I really don't want to be Chicken Little, but I think we do want to put some level of, if you let distress happen too long, you become about distress, right? And I think, I was joking with a friend the other day, and I sort of said, I'm sure people in Detroit, I'm old enough to remember, when the auto industry collapsed and downtown became sort of a ghost town, and you looked at some of these old office buildings that have become essentially in disrepair, right? Well, those used to be Class A trophy office buildings for the auto industry, and they got deserted and no funds to support them, and people just literally throwing back the keys and sort of saying, I don't want to run this building anymore. And it's, Arlington I don't think has a vision that ever that could happen. But I think you don't want to test the waters on how much an old building can stick around before it becomes an issue. And, quite frankly, with 1401 Langston, we know that something like a vacant asset that's just sitting around creates challenges, right? And how it affects the community. So I think that challenge of sort of like, it's not only just the sort of dollar for dollar, but it's about sort of how do we reimagine some of these sites, given that land is still our most precious asset here in Arlington, to be most productive or the highest and best use.
One last.
Yeah, because we are over time, but
Okay.
this is a good discussion, so I didn't want to cut it off.
Well, I mean, and
No.
Oh, God.
We were going to end
I'm
it at
leaving
30.
at 9.
No, we were going to end it
I
at 30.
gotta go home. No, I was gonna say is that there's I think the creative piece that you were talking about, I think is important. Because there's a lot of unique aesthetic value that we can get out of this too. Like I still remember there's this apartment building in downtown Richmond that used to be a bank. And every time I go there and I walk past it, I think, wouldn't that be cool to live in an old bank, like the old timey vaults and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that kind of value, the sort of character, the culture, the elements that we can bring to this by keeping these older buildings around, even with the roadside grill, the curved structure on that. I mean, it
worked.
they worked it in. It's historical. It brings a little bit of something that makes that part of Arlington unique. And I think through this, we're able to keep a lot of these pieces that make Arlington unique.
Yeah. And I'll just give a plug for our brutalist architecture that we haven't much.
Here.
You're not gonna make that better in many ways, but I tell you, this is still a solution to make that more functional than it is
It will be worse.
today.
And
The
you can
carbon
change the facade
footprint
too.
of that. Yeah.
There's a lot you can do with that.
Those concrete buildings are just massive
I know.
carbon footprint.
Yeah.
So anytime we save.
And I'm glad you mentioned embodied carbon because we have had that discussion. There's an active discussion about the one-time trade for embodied carbon with redevelopment that I am just on the outside looking in with, the folks that are in that business. I would agree that the embodied carbon with building upgrades, because every building is going to upgrade. Like I always say, they're not going to go find 1980s version HVAC systems to put into a new building, like a building. They're going to upgrade. But that will be, I can tell you, there'll be robust discussion with our Community and Climate Change Commission and staff and all that about, what that trade-off is to give good advice to the board on sort of what that.
Yeah, because we've really given props to recent developments that kept the garage, for example.
Yeah.
It's like, yes,
Yeah.
good, you're using
Or
something
that.
that's there, yes, good.
Yeah.
So, anyway, we are running over. Do we have any public commenters?
No.
Okay. With that said,
I probably bored them all to death. They probably all went to sleep.
we're pretty much done for this evening, so knock, we're over. Thank you for coming out this evening for this, and so you'll be back before us again?
Yeah, so a little inside baseball, but yeah, we have an October 15th ZOCO date that I know we've talked with Nick to talk with you about. We may try to just invite that to a broader group to talk about part of it, the policy, part of it, the actually zoning text amendments, but we'll get back to you on that.
October 15th.
October 15th.
I think it's October 15th. It's a Wednesday, I think.
Yeah, I
I'm
will
sorry.
be in New York.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the reality, so I think we're looking at October as a pretty, a lot of engagement type stuff. So I think we're going to try to figure out how to work with the commission the best to try to.
Lunch and share it.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, is it going to be a joint LRPC and ZOCO, or is it good
That's
just
what we
straight
haven't
out.
determined.
That's what we haven't determined yet, but I think there's some value to that, but it could be that there's two separate meetings. I mean, it could be.
Yeah, it's one of the nights that we reserved for either an LRPC or a Zoco
Oh, I
meeting.
got it. Okay.
So it's a
So, but
backup date.
Zoco, obviously, it's.
Yeah.
It's, yeah,
But
It's one
definitely,
of
we'll
those
work
dates.
with you guys, anything you
Yeah.
need. Yeah, well, this is a big deal.
Yeah, up to including a robust discussion in front of the full body of the commission, right? Like, I think, while we always like to have these meetings and sort of get a lot of the issues discussed at committee level and then have a very, I think we understand this is a lot to process. And we understand it from staff. We've been processing it for a while now, and it's still very much
Yes.
a bit overwhelming. So we understand that, taking the time to do it. We still are very, very much focused on, as the board, on November. But we're not gonna step over sort of a process of understanding and learning to do so. So,
But I think all of us also get the urgency for this.
Yeah.
It's something we really can't mess around with forever. We have to make decisions and move on, and then with experience, go back and tweak, but moving ahead, I do think it is a crisis. It's something that,
Are we not
where we
recording
can control something, but it's a nationwide issue. Every jurisdiction, I think, is really wrestling with this.
Yeah.
And all the more reason for us to move ahead as fast as we can, so we can grab the opportunities when everybody else is just sitting back and not figuring out how to do it.
You knocked us out.
Sorry. Oh, never mind. I'm just chatting now.
Yeah, now I'm just.
no, and for those of you that don't probably realize that December 31st is a bit of an important date in real estate, because that's when
Thank you
your
all.
calendar year, your accounting year begins anew. And so we've had several